After World War II, the Big Three had clear control of the U.S. market. GM, Ford, and Chrysler were happily seeing sales growth, but the independent brands were struggling. Nash-Kelvinator's George Mason believed that the only way to survive was to join forces. Unfortunately, at the beginning, he met a lot of resistance from the other independent brands. After all, Packard had been America's best-selling luxury brand since 1920, and Studebaker was by far the best-selling independent manufacturer. But things would take a turn for the worse quickly, and soon it looked like the remaining independents would have to come together to survive. And there appeared to be an opportunity to create a big fourth. Now keep in mind, at the time, instead of a brand offering several models, each brand was aimed at a specific market segment, and entering a new market segment meant creating a new brand identity, an idea that had started to die off in the 1960s, but now seems to be making a comeback. This was a concept created by GM under Alfred Sloan in an attempt to avoid internal competition. He essentially chopped the market up into various price segments and then assigned a division specifically to that market. And a merger of the major independent brands would put this new unified company on par with the Big Three, with Studebaker already sitting in the entry-level market with Ford, Chevy, and Plymouth, and Packard in the luxury car segment, already competing with Cadillac and Lincoln, leaving Nash and Hudson to fill in the mid-priced markets in between. By the post-World War II era, the general consensus was that 5 divisions was optimal to cover the various market segments, and all of the Big Three would have 5 divisions at some point during this decade, GM being the standard to match, with Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, and Cadillac, as well as their GMC truck division. Chrysler already had the Plymouth, Dodge, DeSoto, and Chrysler divisions, and in 1955 would break off Imperial as a separate division to challenge Cadillac directly. Ford started the decade with Ford, Mercury, and Lincoln, but by the end of the decade made an attempt to move Mercury upmarket and created the EDSEL division to fit between Ford and Mercury, and in an attempt to regain some of the prestige that Lincoln lost after moving down market after the war, created the new Continental division. So the unification of Nash, Hudson, Packard, and Studebaker would have only been 4 brands, but in the early 1950s these 4 brands already had a wider range of markets, as Nash had already moved into the small car segment with the Rambler, and would soon offer a sports car with the Nash-Healey. So they could have easily created a 5th division, either by breaking off the Rambler models as a new entry-level brand, or, as there was already talk about doing, break off Packard's base-level model Clippers as a separate division to compete directly against Buick and Chrysler. And all of this nearly happened. In 1954, Nash and Hudson would merge to create American Motors, and Studebaker and Packard would merge to create Studebaker-Packard, and there were agreements between the 2 new companies for parts and development sharing. But almost immediately after all of this happened, George Mason died, and George Romney took over AMC, putting any chance of a big fourth to an end, partly because it became quickly obvious that Studebaker's debts were overwhelming Packard, and partly because George Romney decided that AMC would change its focus and concentrate on small cars, eliminating both the Nash and Hudson brands in favor of a newly revised Rambler division. The result of all this was not favorable for Studebaker-Packard. For 1956, there was an attempt to separate the Clipper models from the more expensive Packards, but for 1957, all Packards were Clippers and essentially just classed up Studebakers. And in an attempt to focus on the seemingly more profitable entry-level Studebakers, the Packard division was killed off after 1958. Which helped Studebaker carry on for a while, but the doors officially closed in 1966, although 2 of its most recently developed products would continue on independently as Avanti and Excalibur. Meanwhile, AMC's move to smaller cars seemed successful, at least until the Big Three got serious about the market segment, at which point Rambler simply became AMC, and attempted to take on the big three on its own, which it succeeded in doing fairly well into the early 70s, but financially simply couldn't continue to keep up, and by the late 70s was taken over by Renault, and a decade later would be taken over by Chrysler to be restructured as Eagle before disappearing from existence in 1999. But one has to wonder what could have been. What sort of cars could have come from a unified Packard, Studebaker, Nash-Hudson? Would the U.S. luxury car market be different if Cadillac's most successful competitor had survived beyond the 1950s? Would a unified AMC have retained control of the small car markets and held off import expansion? Would a continued Nash sports car have changed the way that we look at performance cars in the U.S.? Would the four brands combined have lasted longer together, or was it inevitable that these brands would disappear? And where would that leave Jeep? Would it still have joined AMC? Would one of the big three have taken it over? Or would it have failed completely without the support of another brand? All questions we will never know the answer to, but it is something to think about. As always, thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.